either, but I don't know if he...
All right. Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Give people a chance to settle in. Terrific. Thank you very much for coming to the session. I'm Cesar Brea with Force 5 Partners. I wanted to first of all thank Debbie and her team for organizing this. This is terrific. Yet another great session in a long series of wonderful MITX programs. As we're putting together this session, this notion of the multi-agency context seemed like a really important thing to address, given that the reality of our lives in many cases is that even though you're hearing from individuals up here, very often a decision-making process is a consensual one that involves reconciling a lot of different perspectives. And then Publicis and Omnicom went and got together this past week, and now the press is talking about how we're going to see even more agency consolidation. And so what seemed like a perfectly reasonable topic to address all of a sudden seems, by the end of next week, there'll only be one agency left in the world, and, it'll be moot. So, drat, so I'll have to come up with some other topic on the fly here. No, seriously, I think this notion of how you get beyond the actual analysis itself and orchestrate an analytic process that gets people onto the same page to make better decisions is an important one, as important, I think, as actually the techniques that you apply to the analysis itself. And so what we've done is we've put together a panel of folks who have some really interesting perspectives on the topic, and we thought we'd let you hear from them a little bit and then actually maybe take some questions at the end. Before we dive in, Debbie mentions that there apparently is a problem with the Wi-Fi that folks are working to resolve. So it's fixed. Okay, terrific. So you can go ahead and tweet away in your Match.com sad little lives, I guess. Isn't that what we all learned this morning? So anyway, that was for those of you who arrived late. That's an inside joke. We'll catch you up on later. So anyway, why don't we start over with Paul? Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and so forth? He works at an undisclosed location.
I work down in Baltimore at T Rowe Price. I work in the retail direct business, and I've managed the customer acquisition area as well as the client development area. I'm a big user of analytics, and increasingly I'm moving into managing some of our analytics teams and working on strengthening the connections between our analytics teams and our decision makers, our business leaders.
Hi, I'm Sony Chung. I come from Google. What's up? Oh, and I've been at Google for 2 years. I work in the Agency Business Development Group, which is a consulting arm for Google, and we serve a variety of agencies. My particular role is focused on the analytics and the data that Google can provide to help agencies tell more interesting stories about brands and for their clients. And then the other thing that we do is we also are building other insight tools for brands and agencies to kind of leverage so that they can combine with what they currently have.
Great. I'm Don Ryan. I'm a partner with iKnowtion. We're a 12-year-old company located up here in Burlington. But my roots go way back in the early 80s when I started working for a large database marketing company in the area. And if you want to learn about our company, I'd advise you to go to our website. There were two comments I wanted to make. One is back in the early 80s, being in the analytics world was kind of interesting. I would say when clients came in to talk with us, I always got relegated to the lunchtime speaking time frame, so I felt kind of like a cabaret singer as people were reaching for potato salad and chips and so forth. So it's great to see so many people coming out in the field. I feel like my life has not been lived in vain. It's a fantastic turnout here. The other thing I'd say is a comment from the last suggestion about how do you train new people when they come in the marketplace. I've been around a long time. I would say if you're a new student, a graduate, or a consultant, I would say get yourself in as many client meetings as you can or decision-making meetings in the company you work with. Just sit there and listen to the conversation. What are people asking about? And then go figure out how to solve those problems.
Hi, everyone. My name is Manu Matthew. I am the CEO of Visual IQ. We started the company many years back. Actually, our first attribution model was rolled out in 2006 along with the likes of Atlas. I don't know if anyone remembers engagement mapping. But we've actually been delivering attribution solutions for many leading brands, Vanguard, Amex, Toyota, just to name a few. So excited to be here and share some of those learnings with you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So As we prepared for this session, we were trying to think about how you take something like getting people aligned analytically and break it down into some component pieces. And in our conversation, we organized things around trying to get to shared data, shared logic, and shared objectives. So what we thought we'd do is sort of try to take each of those topics in turn and talk a little bit about how folks have seen those particular objectives approached successfully and otherwise. So let me start with data. A lot of people talk about one version of the truth. So Manu, you wrote a post for the MITX blog, shameless plug, last week, where you wrote, and the quote is, "The solution is the centralization of the measurement function." Now, at the risk of starting a Jerry Springer style or Ricky Lake style chair fight up here on stage, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that and talk about how far you've seen that been taken successfully, where the limits in practice have been. How far can you take that?
Sure. So lots to talk about chair fights today, I noticed.
Analytics conference after all.
Yeah, apparently. So just, like I said earlier, we've had a ton of experience working with large and small brands. So one of the things I think right out the gate is to make sure that the folks recognize it's a multi-stakeholder problem that they're trying to solve. And hopefully that allows the organization to select a sponsor or really a champion for that project. But to recognize that there are really kind of two ways you could solve that. One is to attempt to eat the elephant in one bite and engage in a long, sort of drawn-out process for solving this data problem. The other one is to take a much more prescriptive approach that is kind of tied into the DNA of that organization to solve the problem on a much smaller scale, get some wins, get some momentum, and then sort of roll it out from there. I'll use an example of Amex, one of our clients for about 4 years. Came to us and said, look, here's our objective. We want to optimize media within the consumer cards group. And oh, by the way, you can't just do digital optimization because obviously their spend is fairly large. So they engaged us to actually eat the elephant in one bite, and we ended up integrating 22 different channels in about 7 weeks, even before we started the modeling process and use of our platform, with a lot of success. So 4 years later, we're still doing work over there. But that's the approach they took, because by virtue of how they're spending media dollars, that dictated what the strategy should be. On the other hand, you have a client like Vanguard that took a much more prescriptive approach and said, you know what, we're just going to focus on the digital side, specifically display and search, integrate that, and get some wins, and then find that as an avenue to move the organization forward, help everybody understand what the measurement platform is, what the benefit of centralizing the data was. And fast forward sort of 2 years into the engagement, they were driving a ton of success with just optimizing display and search to reduce sort of cost per household acquisition. That then went off to the office of the CEO, CFO, and the entire organization today is really using a centralized view of metrics and so forth. So really two different approaches that we've seen, but you'll probably end up either on one extreme or somewhere in the middle.
Well, and I just think it's interesting that even Amex, going to you guys, it's a third-party data provider to centralize and look at the data, because I think, just my purview looking at the agencies, I think more brands are moving away from agencies measuring their own work, because it can be self-serving, or they just don't trust that option. And so more and more agencies are looking for opportunities with companies like yours, or even consulting companies. The Sapiens, the Accentures, and the McKinseys are getting into the game as well. And it's interesting with the whole merger, I think it kind of plays into the agencies recognizing that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Paul, you've been running a process to try to get this kind of alignment across a whole bunch of different folks in the last couple of years. How important has the centralization been for you? How far you've been able to push that? Where are you going from here?
Yeah, we were in a similar situation a couple of years ago, and I was smiling at some of the notes before about storytelling and so forth, because 3 or 4 years ago within T Rowe Price, when looking at sort of the acquisition spend, we had great stories being told by our digital team, by our TV team, by some of the in-house teams that manage print, and it was hard to make sense of to reconcile the different stories together. And so some of the comments that Manu talks about on his post blog, I think, were very relevant where we were sitting. And so we started a couple of years ago a process to try and bring the data together and bring the process together. But the first step with the data, one of our first attempts there to sort of test the concept was to do some significant extracts and bring it to a provider, and happened to be iKnowtion with Don Ryan, and start looking holistically at how our acquisition ecosystem was performing. And more recently, we're attempting to bring that process in-house, not at the same depth and not with the same quality perhaps that we have, but we're trying to build an in-house process that we can sustain with enough quality to make better decisions than we have in the past. Mm-hmm. So that I think it sounds like a lot of us are at sort of a common crossroads at needing to sort of go from legacy models to improved models, and certainly I know within our firm the pressure on marketing to demonstrate the value that's being added and to increase the productivity of the marketing spend year over year is going to increase. We see that it's driven in part by margin compression in our business, and I'm sure in a lot of other businesses. So the pressure is on. We don't need to just perform now, but we're going to need to constantly improve our productivity as we go forward. So increased investment in analytics is probably a major feature of our future marketing operations.
So maybe shifting gears a little bit to talk about the logic piece of it. Don, when we chatted originally, one of the points you made was this notion that it's actually a lot easier to get agreement about what happened in the past, and a lot harder to get agreement about what we ought to do in the future about that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the techniques and some of the lessons you've developed over the years, and both what works and what the limits of those things are.
Yeah. Well, picking up too from Paul's comment about the centralization of data to begin with, I would say that probably 10, 15 years ago, most of us in the field felt like sort of consumer paleontologists. We were out searching for clues about who was consumer man. And sometimes you'd find just a little bit of bones in the soil, and you could say, wow, can I construct some figure out of this? Bringing the information together from multiple sources allows you to have a much better picture, obviously, of the consumer or the performance of a marketing program. So we advocate going around a corporation and looking for where are relevant data assets that can be brought together to do a better job of that. But as we were talking about earlier last week, it's a lot easier to be a historian and kind of look back and say, well, we spent this money on these programs or targeted towards these customers, and what happened? And so you're counting up results. You may have slightly different interpretation about what happened, but usually you can come to agreement on how many accounts were open, how many dollars were spent, and so on and so forth. I think the interesting problem is, particularly for decision makers, is not so much what happened with the money I spent last year or the year before, but I'm about to spend $100 million, $300 million, $1 billion on advertising and customer development. Where should I spend it, and what am I going to get for it? So we like to think of developing tools that are part microscope, being able to look backwards in time and drill into different populations and programs, but also to turn those tools around and make them telescopes into the future to say, what's likely to happen? What's the best that can happen if I allocate my spend correctly, if I target the right customers? Because ultimately I'm going to have to go in front of the red carpet with the executive group and say, here's what I think is going to happen, and then we'll play out and see exactly what does happen.
So, one of the things I'm fixated on is your comment about consumer man, who I realize may be a failed evolutionary spur, now dominated by, consumer woman in this age, perhaps more appropriately. But one of the things that I'm curious about is, and Sonia, when we talked about, we had our conversation, you had noted that, this is still as much art versus science, and in the course of trying to get different agencies and internal partners on the same page, that leaves a sort of a gray zone where if somebody asserts a point, somebody else can sort of make the point that it's still, it's still art. Where does that help and hurt the decision-making process internally?
Well, I feel like everyone knows Google from just, AdWords and the search data that we have. Yeah. And I think just based on what Don was saying even, I think we are really well known in terms of performance driving optimization, the science of everything. And so what we're trying to move into, because we've really automated that. That is something that we've showed tried and true, we've done for years. And at this point, a lot of it has been proven out. I think what we're trying to do now is look more at the art of the analytics and understand this, either one, storytelling about a brand, because our database is not only people searching, but it really is a database of perceptions and people's intentions. If you think about from the standpoint of yourself when you're searching for something, or when you're watching TV and you're doing something online in the google.com in the box, when you think about that, it's human interaction, it's human engagement. And so that's where we're trying to take it to another level. And so that's where I think the art comes into play. I think the other thing is we're trying to look at kind of two sides. There's the performance side, and then there's this brand side, which we feel that a lot of advertisers and brands haven't really fully taken advantage of how people perceive their brand online. And I think you may do a lot of research, you may interview 50 people. In the end, how people are searching for your brand, the different keywords they use with that, is really indicative of where your brand is going. And what's pretty incredible about the Google data is we offer it not only 9-10 years in terms of where your brand was then, but also as recent as today. So I think that's, to be able to see that dynamic and see how your brand and the different partnerships your brand has changes over time is quite interesting. We did something, I was at a client, an agency in New York, and one of their clients was Coke, and they're like, oh wait, let's look at this tool. And Coke has had a partnership with the Olympics for 20-some years, and I was like, kind of at the edge of the seat, I'm like, I'm not sure what this is going to say. So we looked at the tool to see the relationship and how Coke was co-searched and how that dynamic has changed every 4 years, as well as the off-Olympic years. And it was incredibly, it was so on par with where Coke would want it to be, but we didn't know for sure if it was going to say that. And so it was very, very interesting to show, not only relative to the competitors, but compared to other sponsors, where Coke had really taken that partnership. And the search data told us all of that.
I wonder if we could just push further a little bit on that, because I mean, from my own personal experience, as an example, we've had great luck using Google Trends to sort of facilitate some of these conversations, and as almost sort of a proxy for brand tracking in a sense. Where have you seen the productive kind of interplay between art and science, real time in those conversations, and where do you think when you're sitting at the table in a sort of multi-agency context, and there's a lot of different players, where do you see that as maybe a less productive, more flawed kind of conversation where people are trying to bring pseudo facts to bear and so forth? I wonder if you could just comment on sort of scenarios you've seen that have worked better and scenarios that maybe haven't as well.
I think there's a multitude of things. I think it gets really complex when you have multiple agencies in the room. And I think, I think about just the scenarios I've had with a creative agency, a media agency, a CRM agency, the digital shop, and there's all these different flavors of that. So it does get very complex. I think part of it has to do with whether the CMO or on the client side, a senior person really kind of put some key metrics or goals that they want in place, and everybody falls from there. I think what's really interesting, though, is when you do put the agencies together, because everybody has a slightly different perspective on how they want to move the brand. And I think what's really interesting is that in those scenarios, they are much more open to seeing new tools, because media agencies have their own tools, creative agencies have their own tools. They have different even skill sets, account planners versus data analytic people versus media comms planners. And so what's quite interesting is that when you start introducing and flip the model to say, you're using what you're using today, but for you to continue to elevate your game and to bring new things to your clients and your brands, what other tools are you going to add to this mix? And so we've been trying to encourage that and really think very differently about obviously the data that we can provide from a Google perspective, but also how to merge our data potentially with GRP data to do predictive analytics, or to understand how search data can be a proxy for how successful your commercial is. During the Super Bowl, it's really interesting to see the minute-by-minute data on during the Super Bowl, but also before and after, because there's a lot of pre-planning before, but there's also a lot of post-viewing on the really fun and different type of commercials that you see. So that has been really indicative, and also it tells us how they're searching for that commercial. It might not just be Doritos or Nike, but also what words are they using to say it's funny or it's a really inappropriate commercial. So that has been used for a lot of brands and agencies as a research tool, and we've been trying to encourage the agencies to take advantage of that.
Cesar, if I could just
Yeah,
add one
please
thing.
do, yeah.
So one of the things that, as we work with a lot of clients, one of the things that centralized data from a cross-channel perspective does, just to touch on Sonia's point, is that you're putting in place a system that not only tells you what you're planning for, but then also to actually capture some of these data points. It's an evolution. So the data system is actually growing and growing, but at the center of it is how that specific user, anonymous or known, existing or new, is interacting with the brand. What creatives are they seeing, what offers they're responding to, what publishers they're interacting with from a cross-channel perspective. So that actually helps to drive that sort of unified view, allows sort of the display agency to consume the agency the data one way, or the search agency to do it another way. So a lot of folks that play a role in helping to centralize that data actually benefit from the output. And we're also finding that one of the other key drivers of centralization data is not only trying to solve better measurement, and that is also coming from the finance side of the equation, where they're trying to get much more clarity into what is actually happening, how many leads did we actually get. But the underlying sort of belly of it drives a ton of insights and analytics about the consumer and how they engage with the brand.
And it's interesting because I think more agencies and brands are looking for analytics for planning and upstream discussions, because I think the optimization, I mean there's continual ways that you have automation to do that, but I think that same data, while we've used it for campaign optimization, can also be used for media inspiration, media allocation, creative ideation. There's a ton of different things, and I just think people have used the same methods, and I think now a lot of what I'm seeing, a lot of advertisers are open to seeing different ones out there.
Yeah. So Sonia, you made a really interesting and important point, I thought, around the need in a multi-agency context with a lot of different objectives and a lot of different data sources that you could bring to bear, the need for a strong leadership to establish which metrics to pay attention to and the relative priority among those. And Paul, I want to come back to you and maybe ask you to talk a little bit about how you've done that, in particular an organization like T Rowe, which is as a very collaborative management style in terms of how things get done.
So we, in the last 24 months, we asked and then mandated that our analytics partners come together, our external partners, our internal teams, come together around the same table to sort of undertake this exploration together. So it started with centralizing the data, but then in terms of identifying metrics, in terms of identifying tools and approaches, we actually went through a fairly expensive process for a year where we would meet monthly and try and reconcile approaches, choose how we were going to do it. And I think it was necessary for us to get the agencies aligned and sort of the internal processes aligned. We can't afford to kind of perpetuate that full team process going forward, but it helped us to sort of go from those separate narratives coming in silos and sort of that partial picture of a client or a part of a client's experience to a view that we need to sort of look at things holistically, that we need to turn the corner in terms of our analytical approaches, and then even in terms of deciding on KPIs and so forth. That was something we threw out to that team, and that it's helped align the team, and I think it's supporting the ongoing work at this point.
Yeah, I would just add to that, too. One of the things that we promote is the wisdom of crowds theory, and you've heard me talk about this before, but we like to, in our kind of engagements, is to get many different diverse opinions in a room as possible. Not necessarily to form a consensus. We don't want that to happen, but we want to have different people represented. And sometimes those conversations may happen offline as opposed to just around the table together. But we urge our clients to have people not only from the marketing function or executive function, but from finance, from product development, from customer care, all the different elements of the business that might be important in determining what that customer experience is going to be and how the entire business is going to be affected. And you'll be amazed at how many good suggestions you'll get from different people that maybe you wouldn't have thought about originally. simply because they've been in the business, they have some of their own opinions formed through the experiences that they've had. And I think it's important then for the analysts to hear what's going on in those conversations, to figure out ways in which they can serve those groups.
Terrific. Let me shift gears and see if we can take some questions from all of you about some of the experiences that folks have up here. Over here. Somebody got a microphone? Eric has led Blaze the way this morning in terms of how to be a gallant moderator.
Thank you. So I have, many of you actually mentioned that about working as a team if you work with different agencies. I'm actually representing the agency and we're working in a multi-agency context environment with some of our multi-billion companies, our clients. So of course there's some level of collaboration between the agencies, but there's also a lot of competition and unwillingness to share the information, the data, the voice, the time that they can dedicate to their clients. How would you actually make agencies work as a team in this environment? Thank you.
So just from our perspective, a lot of what we suggest the client to do is, now this is the role of the sponsor really, to set the rules and as Paul said, make sure there's alignment between the different agencies and how they're going to benefit from consolidated, centralized data to basically drive better, smarter campaigns. And we see that all the time and with a lot of success. But it really starts with the advertiser and the sponsor setting context as to why it's important. And that helps to drive and facilitate. But keep in mind, it's an evolutionary process too. You don't wake up tomorrow and everyone's going at it. I think it starts because you now have a system that allows you to not only look at what happened historically, but you can now collaborate and look at what that data is telling you and how you should go about sort of creating the next campaign, using the data to sort of drive some of those decisions. We've also seen examples where even within a specific agency, that helps to facilitate that process too. Between display and search within one agency, don't always talk to each other. But this is also a similar process to help drive that. But I think the other thing to take away from this is also the agency context is one of them, but you have partners on the other side that are driving traffic and so forth that can also benefit from centralized data that today aren't necessarily getting comped on the effort that they put forward on their marketing side. So we've had instances and success stories where the agency will use that data to now have a much cleaner and much more productive dialogue with partners that they're buying media from. So and you don't have to kind of go there from day one. You kind of build that into your roadmap and how you go about solving for that.
Other questions over here?
As Sonia mentioned before, the balance of art and science. How do those of you that don't work, I guess everyone except Paul, how do you, as a partner that provides just data, how do you continually work with the creative agencies to continue the art side of that science with different points of view and different conflicting interests to work with those creative folks to continue to provide the art to go along with the science?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've been fortunate to work with most of the major agencies here in Boston and other parts of the country, really trying to be a collaborator with them because we know that the data itself isn't the answer. Even the insights themselves, it's been mentioned a lot of times already today, that getting to implementation, getting to action is very important. And while the data can tell part of the story, there's certainly other elements that come into play that I think agencies are in a great position to add to the discussion. So we try to be as collaborative as we can with agencies, and we've had great partnerships for 10 years or more in doing that. And oftentimes they drive us towards more innovative ways of looking at information. And at the same time, I think we drive them towards more interesting programs for their clients.
And just to add to that, I think it's a really interesting question because we've had a couple models here at Google. Like we have given agencies tools like here are 10 tools, go to town with these tools. And unfortunately, we haven't had success in seeing them take advantage of them. They'll use it for a week and then they're like, these are great. Let me go back to my day-to-day. So what we've been doing more recently in the last couple of months is we've taken on certain projects that make sense with certain advertisers that we think make sense to collaborate. And we actually do, like a consulting agency would do, and we do the insights with them, and we work side by side. They share their research and their media comms tools, and we're using our tools side by side, and we're putting something together to package for the client.
So the other,
Oh, I'm sorry.
the other thing I would just add is going back to the unified view of the customer perspective. So if I have all these anonymous sort of touch points, and I took, say, a Blue Kai sort of tool and laid over that all this audience segment data, now essentially what you have is an environment that allows you to look at, segment A interacting with the creative units A, B, and C in this sequence. So certainly the data is telling you what is going on, and you can look at those characteristics tied to behavioral data, but we're not in a position to sort of say, here's the next great creative idea, but hopefully that's inspirational in terms of telling you how that audience is engaging, consuming that specific asset on that specific publisher.
You talk a lot about CPG type companies. What do you see as the gap with B2B type companies? Certainly kind of this lag in their level of sophistication. So what's the big difference and challenge that you see, or just any comments you want to make about what you're seeing the difference between B2B versus consumer packaged goods?
Okay, great. I'll jump into that because we've had, well, most of our clients have been B2C. We have also worked with B2B companies, and data is a lot harder to get. Aggregating data across enterprises that have multiple locations where the data hasn't been able to be linked together makes it very difficult. You don't oftentimes get the same level of interaction data that you get with consumer, like a financial service organization or a CVS or some of the other companies that we work with, where literally every day we're capturing data on what the consumers are doing. So I think, they do suffer from kind of a data paucity. I think a lot of the same principles are there that they need to work on. They just have, fewer pieces of information to work with. But I think there are lessons that can be learned from the B2C world that can transfer over to B2B. I think getting innovative about how you can get customers to supply information to you, as opposed to, gee, I'm going to go to D&B and these other sources and try to link it together myself, might be one way for those companies to move. Kind of advancing their way in which they can segment. A lot of businesses, whether it's IBM or some others that we've worked with, they have these, well, they're enterprise organizations and they're large, medium, and small businesses. But trying to drive much more differentiation there can help them out.
So one thing I'd add also is on the B2B side, what we find is the channels that are used specifically for acquisition are usually very limited. It's probably paid search, some social, a ton of organic traffic. But what we also find is they are usually the first to have us integrate the CRM side of the equation. So we will integrate with Salesforce to pull that lead and sort of watch, and as Don said, drive attribute level data. So because usually what happens is at that point, that becomes the lead that the sales organization then is driving and chasing down. So just giving them enough information to understand how that lead came through, what was the stimulus that drove it, but then also watching them mature through the process is one of the things we found really more prevalent on the B2B side.
And just to add to that, this is pre my Google days when I was on the agency side. I don't work as much with B2B now, but I did before. And what I find is that even though there's less data, like you were saying, Don, I think the data can be more manageable because a lot of it is linked to CRM systems. It is more manageable to work with. And to be honest, like a lot of technology companies allow the linkage between the data sources to happen more easily. And even getting qualitative data is easier because you have a more committed group of business people that are working together to kind of engage with you.
We'll take one more. Questions across the room? Back there.
This question's for Sonia. So I'm from an agency, and I was just wondering, from your perspective, what has been the response to enhanced campaigns, and how's Google dealing with that? Since I know it's impacted in sort of a large way how agencies are reporting their data. And
yeah. So for all of those that don't know, Enhanced Campaign, it is a new, I think it was started to get implemented in April, and I think if we just finalized the full implementation across agencies, which is a new way, a more aggregate way to consolidate our performance data pieces between the different AdWords and DoubleClick performance platforms. It's been spotty, I'll be honest. It's been really spotty. I mean, I think anytime you have systems that are done a certain way and we're migrating to something new, there's always resistance. So we have seen that resistance. But on the other hand, there are Google doesn't think 1 year out. We never think like that. We think 5, 10, 15 years out. And so we're trying to plan for the future, and we hear loud and clear what agencies and our partners need. And so Enhanced Campaign is our response to that. We know coming out of the gate it's not the perfect solution, but in several years you will see why we have to set up the platform the way it is. So hopefully that helps.
Good. All right, why don't we stop there? Sure, we'd be happy to take a few questions afterwards, but thank you all for participating, and thank you to the panelists.